Okay, welcome. Welcome. My name is Mark van Eyck. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP from the Netherlands. I work for Innovative, which is a cloud integrator based out of the Netherlands. Small country, a lot of technical people there. And this session is called Troubleshooting Windows Azure Pack Providers. And over a year ago, or exactly a year ago, I had a session with Principal Group Program Manager Bradley Bart of the Windows Azure Pack team. And that was on deploying and designing Windows Azure Pack. Now, if I ask of you guys, how many guys of you have actually installed Windows Azure Pack? Please keep your hands up. Out of you, who have never, ever experienced an issue in that environment? All hands go down again. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Windows Azure Pack is a bad product. I strongly believe even that is the best thing that could happen to a private cloud or a service provider. But it has a lot of providers. And each provider had a lot of components, which has moving parts and adds complexity. And this complexity will cause issues. So we'll look at what the agenda is for today. You'll boot it up, your Windows Azure Pack environment. It's smoothly running. And there is an update code rollup coming in, or you made a change to your environment, and somehow it stopped. And now you need to troubleshoot that issue. What's the first thing you're going to do? Well, you need to figure out what's the actual provider that's causing me the issue. Am I not able to deploy a virtual machine, or am I not able to create a website, or whatever? Am I not able to access the environment in the first place? There is a great source out there for every product from Microsoft, which is the TechNet forum or the MSDN forum. And if we look at the forum, that is what is monitored by the product group, but it's also monitored by MVPs and guys like yourself who can ask questions and also answer them. So we'll look at that TechNet forum and what's actually interested about that. Then we'll dive into the inner workings of Windows Azure Pack itself and all the individual providers. Now, there's a lot of ground to cover. So what I please ask you guys, if you ask questions, hold them up to the back, and I'll wait here and answer your questions if you have any, because it's already tricky to merge it into, like, 75 minutes. We'll dive into each of those individual components, all 8 of them, and we'll look at how the traffic flows through the system. We'll touch each component, and in essence, we'll look at the communication path of those components. Now, there's a lot of information on each component. We have event logs, and if we look at those information positions, there are like 5 of them that are interesting and 500 which are not. Now, which are the ones that you should be actually looking at? This is what we're going to deep into in this particular session. And the complete purpose of the session is to give you a generic approach of troubleshooting an average issue. So we're not discussing 5 demos, giving you 5-point solutions to solve those particular 5 issues. It's a reference, in essence, that you can use whenever you have a trouble in your environment. You can take this reference, follow the steps that I'm going through, and it should work like for 80 or 90% of the issues that you're going to hit. With the essence and the intention to keep your environment up and running as fast and as good as possible. Now, do you have an idea how many providers are in Windows Azure Pack? Is that 5? More? Who says more? Exactly. There's a difference between resource providers that will actually deploy or manage resources, and there are a couple of other providers too. So if we crack open Windows Azure Pack, you'll see that we have VM clouds, which provide something like IaaS. We see that we have websites. That says enough, probably. We have databases, and that is MySQL and SQL databases that we can provision. We have Service Bus, a reliable messaging system, and we have free providers, and these are not necessarily resource providers. That is identity, which allows you to log on into the first place, automation, and usage. And usage is also a tricky one, so we'll dive into that later on. First, if we look at that forum, what seemed like a good idea when I started it quickly turned out into a lot of work. I figured it might be interesting to have a look at the forum, and if we scroll down, you'll see that there's about 650 items in there. I actually read all of them. I did an inventory, and these are the questions that you guys probably asked. And if we scroll down, what I actually did is look at all the items and recorded what day were they created. Are they still answered or unanswered? What kind of resource provider is it related to? What kind of feature within that resource provider? And what type of question is it? Is it a how-to, or a question like, how do I configure something? Or is it actually an error that you guys hit? And if it isn't an error, is it due to an installation, or due to a configuration, or due to an update that you've done? Now, I spent way too many time on this inventory, but it gives some nice slides when we go back to the deck. So if we pull that up in a nice graph, and we'll go to the next slide, you'll see that, and that's probably not very surprising, that the most questions were actually related to VM clouds, which is IaaS. And then if we look a bit further, the second one is websites. Who does have websites running in their environment? I see 3 hands. That's not a lot. There are a lot of questions, though. Now, the number of questions doesn't necessarily mean the uses of that particular RP in environments. We just noticed that. But that also says something about the complexity that you hit with configuring and installing it. Now, web core, that is actually installing the product itself, so Windows Azure Pack. And all the other RPs are somewhat similar in questions, at least. If we look at that information over time, you'll see that the amount of questions increase. That also has to do with the interest. Now, the question that I got since we were introduced with Azure Stack the other day, what should we do with Windows Azure Pack? Should I install it today or not? I think I had that question like 10 times this week. And my answer is always this, and some of you already heard this. Let's say you want to buy a new phone, and you can buy one now, or there's a new one coming in like 8 or 9 months. Are you going to wait? And even if you decide to wait for that new phone with that new feature, and you're almost there, and it's like 1 month before it's there, and they announce another one, are you going to wait again? Or are you going to run your business today and make money today? So I'd say start with Windows Azure Pack today, because in essence you can just rip out your management stack, your resources will still be valid, and just a matter of having a new management stack and making them work together. Now that's a challenge for Microsoft to make that work as best as possible, but your resources will always be there. So if you're on the path now, considering if you want to wait for Azure Stack to come out or want to start with Azure Pack today, I suggest start with Azure Pack today. If we drill down to the communication between all those different components, I'm usually confronted by diagrams like these. I've seen so many, and the problem is that if they describe an issue, I'm looking at a zillion options that could reflect problems within that environment. So if we look at a couple of communication streams, you'll see that it can become very complex very fast. And I haven't even drawn in all the firewalls and load balancers and HA. That only adds complexity even more. So what I always suggest to do is take the same diagram, but just draw it in another way. And then it's much more clear how all the components work with each other, because all the resource providers and all the other providers have in essence the same relation to Azure Pack. There is a management plane, what Azure Pack is. There is a controller plane, and we'll just drill into one RP for now, but you'll see the other ones coming up soon enough. For instance, VM clouds. Now, VM clouds talk in the controller plane to the data plane. That is where your VM is actually created, the resource. And within the VM clouds controller plane, there's an API. And Azure Pack, which is in essence the head, and the traffic is the blood running through our veins. And the resource provider that you're looking at, that's just the body parts. If you look at it that way, it becomes much more easy to go through a traffic flow and drill into one RP. This is true for every other RP. So this is the same diagram as we saw before, but just represented in another way. Now this does look much more clearer, right? So we just drill down into the VM clouds on the left, and we start with a simple environment, just a simple lab where you have a virtual machine with the Express installer of Windows Azure Pack, and you want to deploy a virtual machine as a tenant. Well, that's easy. Just go to the tenant side, and you say, create new virtual machine. That tenant side actually talks to the tenant API, which in its turn talks to that endpoint. Now, for the VM clouds, that endpoint is SPF. So you could have a second box with VMM and SPF installed. SPF will translate that command to VMM, which will, in its place, execute the job against Hyper-V, which is sitting on a physical host. Now, this is fine for a lab, but if you're working towards a production environment, maybe we should at least distribute it a bit more. We'll see more layers coming in, individual machines, and if we do something with HA, we might even add an additional line with the same components, which then add load balancers to have that in HA fashion. That could be clustered, that could be with a load balancing configuration. Now you can easily see that the amount of pieces that are coming into this picture are adding up and are adding dependencies and pieces that could influence the working of your environment. Now if we look at this from a service provider perspective, you would even see that everything that is provided to the tenant is sitting in a separate domain. That adds even more complexity. The idea of the session is to reduce that complexity. Because in essence, if you look at it from that basic setup we just saw, to the distributed environment, to that HA environment, to those separate domains, it all runs through the same path. It's just a matter of ruling out the components that are not the issue, instead of looking at everything. And you'll just end up with the component that has the actual issue. Now, if we look at that same communication path, there's a lot of dependencies that it has, and on the other hand, a lot of information that you can find. And the idea is that we'll drill down into each RP and look at what kind of information is relevant, what could you be looking at, and use it as a reference for troubleshooting. To set the personas, I'd like you to consider yourself as the admin of the environment and not necessarily an old school admin like you did with Active Directory, because this is all cloud services. So please consider yourself as the cloud admin. You get a fancy code with that as well. But the tricky thing is, since you're a cloud admin, you also get a lot of things on your plate, which is more services, more tenants, meaning more responsibilities. So it's going to be a long, long day. And this is our tenant. This is actually Bob. He went to a bar last night, made it way too late, had too many drinks. What he doesn't know yet is he's going to have a very bad day. We do know that. He's still sleeping in late. He needs to create a couple of resources a day, and he will hit a couple of issues with that. But we guys are going to help him as admin. So while he's waking up, he needs to log on to the environment. That's the first thing he needs to do. And when he's actually logging in, we're looking at identity. Now, if we go back to that inventory that I did, and we look at the questions related to identity, that is, well, I'd say 50-50 on how to configure stuff and actual errors that we got. But the most questions are due to configuration. That is interesting to see. And if we look at the identity path, and I simplified it, but you should look at it this way too, because otherwise you're just looking at all the components and making it difficult for yourself. So we simplify the path. A tenant will access the tenant side. The tenant side will say, I don't know you. You have to authenticate against that STS, Security Token Service. I am redirected as a tenant. If I'm living on the internet, the ADFS environment that's sitting on-prem is probably proxied by a web application proxy. So I'm hitting the web application proxy. Now that has an event log, which is applications and services / ADFS. We can drill down into the event log, and if we have any issues, this is the one that we should be looking at. Then it will communicate with ADFS. That has the same event log location, so that one is easy. And to figure out if the tenant side or it's actually ADFS that's causing the issue, you have the possibility to log on to ADFS directly without considering the tenant side. Because if ADFS is down and you access the tenant side, you will get a timeout with the name of the tenant side. That can be confusing because it's actually ADFS that isn't responding. So to test that, there is a URL. I'm not going to read all the URLs for you. You can get that back from the deck. We're going to see that in the demo too. This is the URL that you can use to directly log on to ADFS without using a relay and party. So for the admin side, who's probably living in the fabric management domain somewhere, he's accessing the admin side from internally. At least that's what I advise you to do. Don't have that admin side running on the internet somewhere. And that process is exactly the same without the fact that he's not going through the web application proxy. He's going to hit the ADFS environment internally directly. That will give him true single sign-on. So if we pull up an environment, let's see if we can switch this. Yes. I have an environment existing of 4 virtual machines sitting in Azure, which is running Windows Azure Pack. And all of the other resource providers are sitting on-prem. Now, to configure all the resource providers, this is the bare minimum that you need. Without HA, so there's a lot of complexity involved already. If we look at identity, then when I open up the tenant side, I'm just causing an issue. Don't look at the actual issue. Don't look at the way or what the actual solution is. Look at the way that I solve that issue. That is the purpose of the demo. That's the purpose of all the demos. So I go to the tenant portal. That was Bob. He's still a bit drunk. It isn't really fast. That's for sure. And before we go any further, these are the real Azure Pack providers. These are the guys from the product team that create Azure Pack. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I'm very happy with the product. So if you help me out, we're going to give them a small round of applause because we're happy with this product. Thank you, thank you. This is recorded, so that's good. So I'm going to log in as Bob. If you can't remember the password, because it was late. Yes, it was late. You had a lot to drink. Yes, thank you. He should be getting an error, at least if I set it up. Has anyone ever seen this error? Yeah, hands going up, 500. Who hasn't solved that yet? Everybody had, okay. Could be due to a couple of issues, but if we look at the way that we just figured out that issue, the first thing that we should be doing is looking at the event log. So we're going to open up the event log, and what I usually do is we look at the event log is a couple of things. I hit the tenant side. Now the tenant side actually redirected me to the admin side. I was able to log on, and I was able to redirect back to the tenant side, which gave me the 500 error. So it should be looking at the tenant side. So that's the first thing that we're going to look at. But before I do that, let me just explain that I have this event viewer open, which has connection to a couple of machines. If you want to have that in your environment, which I think is a good idea, because otherwise you'd just be remoting into different machines all of the time. There's just one thing that you need to do before that. There are 3 event logs, firewall rules, that you should enable on each server before you can actually access that through an event viewer. So it's just a matter of enabling those rules, and from that moment on, you can remote into it with the event viewer from a single machine. So if we look at the logs, there's a couple of steps that you can take. The first thing that I usually do is just look at a filtered view, which is out of the box on all the machines, That's the administrative events. That's like an aggregated view of warnings and errors that you got out of a selection of events and a selection of event logs. Not all of them. But that might give you a high-level overview of what is going on within this machine. Then the second thing that you can do is log on to Applications and Services, Microsoft, Windows Azure Pack, and we'll see this back throughout the deck, and then go to the tenant side, Operational, and you see that I actually have my 500 error number here. Now if we drill down to the next issue, I actually see it says something about unable to validate signature. Now that says something about certificates probably, and if I open that a bit more, I even get the certificate hash back. So if I copy that one over and maybe have a look at ADFS, if that is a known certificate hash. So we'll go to the ADFS environment. Then there is a single easy PowerShell rule which allows you to execute that. And it will actually say, yes, I know that certificate. That is a token signing certificate. Now I should explain something about these token signing certificates. They're there by default in ADFS, and they're there by default in Azure Pack 2. And both will expire after a year. Because if we look at the properties for ADFS, and that's probably a lot, then we drill down to a couple of properties of those, you'll see that there is an auto certificate rollover. That means that after a year, the certificate is going to be renewed automatically. And there are a couple of values to look at. That's the certificate generation threshold that will choose to create a new certificate 20 days before the certificate will expire. And the other one is certificate promotion threshold, which will create that new certificate 5 days after that new certificate is actually created. So 15 days before your certificate expires, a new certificate is automatically generated, which is fine, but your Azure Pack environment, it's using still the same old thumbprint. So if we go back to that Azure Pack environment, this is the issue or the error that I get for that, because it doesn't trust ADFS anymore. So the only way to solve that is execute the relay and party settings again. Now this is probably new to nobody, because you all have installed Windows Azure Pack, and hopefully with ADFS or at least an external identity provider other than the sample that is provided. So we run that script again for both the admin and the tenant side. I'll close the portal again, open it up, and go to the tenant portal. Log on with Bob. Let's see if it's sobered up already. Yeah, much better. And he should be able to log on now properly. He's going to see some errors though. But just to give you an idea, I looked at the tenant side event log. That gave me some kind of information. I used that to look at the source, to verify my settings, and based on that, I changed those settings, and I got the environment up and running again. And while this is loading up, we'll go back to the deck. You'll see that at least one error probably pops up with a resource provider. We'll wait for that one. There it is. So we'll go through each RP in a similar fashion. I've got a couple of demos, but in essence, it's just to give you an idea, where should I be looking at if I have an issue? Then for each RP, I also have got a couple of best practices or learnings, or at least things I figured out throughout the couple of years that I've been working with the product. We just mentioned that you were able to log on to ADFS directly. You can also retrieve the federation metadata directly, which is an XML file, which I just used to set up that federation again. You can verify claims. Sri, who's sitting in the front, we actually have a session together on Friday morning, so this is a shameless pitch for that session, which will cover ADFS in depth together with Azure Pack. So please come and join that session. Not sure what the exact time is, but you use Fiddler, for looking at the claims that actually come into the environment. You can use a Windows Identity Foundation sample, which is in the SDK, which will create a website and allow you to surface the claims that are coming in without using Azure Pack in the first place. Or you could create a GPO which will enable auditing on your ADFS environment and will show you the actual claims that are coming in just in the event log. So there are a couple of options that you can take there. And we just looked at the auto-renew of the ADFS certificates. Now the tenant, he just left home. He wasn't too happy because he wasn't able to log on to the environment. So Bob just came into the office and he needs to deploy a virtual machine for the work he's going to do today. Now we look at the IaaS capabilities within the environment. If we look at TechNet, there are a lot of questions related to that, mainly because, at least it's what I believe, most people are using those IaaS capabilities within Windows Azure Pack. And also we see that the most questions are related to configuration. Now this one becomes a little more complex because more components get involved. If we look at the VM clouds, the first thing that you'll actually do in the admin side is connect it to that API, which in this case is SPF. The admin side will talk to the tenant side, or the admin API, and both have their own event log. Then the admin API registers to SPF, and each endpoint has a URL that you can use to test it. So if you hit an issue and you see something within the admin API or the admin side log, and you're not sure if you're able to access the endpoint, you can just use an URL to actually connect to that endpoint directly and test it. Now that URL is different for each RP, so it's all recorded within the deck, so you can just copy it over. But please consider that you should at least test it to figure out if the endpoint is working properly. Now this is the same for the tenant side and the tenant API. We'll look at the communication path, so the tenant will actually deploy a virtual machine who will connect to the tenant side, tenant API, which will in its place talk to SPF. SPF will translate that RESTful call to PowerShell, where VMM is able to work with. VMM will then deploy either to Hyper-V if we're deploying or interacting with a virtual machine, or to the HMV gateway if doing something with network virtualization. My advice is if you hit an issue somewhere over here, is try to repro it from VMM directly, depending on where you figure out that an actual issue is. Just ruling out components. Go with the steps every time. What works, go to the next one. Now I have a special guest today who will help us at least with a demo for the VM clouds. Kylie, she's working for the product team. Please give her a round of applause.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. As Mark said, I'm a program manager for the Azure Pack team, and I'm going to demo the VM clouds for you. Are we on the right machine? Cool. All right, so Bob is our tenant, and he goes in and he wants to create a new VM cloud, or VM role. And so he goes in and he clicks on try to create from gallery. And as you can see here, there is nothing in his gallery. So he's kind of upset. He's already had a bad morning, right? So he calls you up because, we're all his admins. So he says, what's going on? And so first, your first step is to repro the issue. And so you hit this and you see the same thing going on. You also see this little error pop up that said, errors encountered when you're loading VM data. Bob probably just went right by this error and, just didn't think anything of it. So first you go to your event logs. And so we'll go into the tenant site operational log. And if we go to the first error, we see that we hit, what we saw in the portal. And then we keep going until we see the, oh. Refresh. There we go. Sorry about that. So then we see that, Here we go. This is not the right error. Sorry about that. Well, we should see an error that says there's a potential mismatch in your SPF subscription or your versioning. So what we would do is we'd go to the portal, back to the portal, and you hit Control-Alt-A to understand the version. And then in every update release that we release in the KB article, they tell you what version, the same version ID, so you can compare those two to make sure you're on the right version. So if we go ahead and open up that KB article, give it a second to load. We'll go all the way down to the bottom, almost the bottom, where it says files updated in this rollup. And you exit out of Microsoft. Usually we would want you to participate in our surveys, but not during a demo. So, okay, so now we can see the version number. And if you directly compare that with our version over here, you see that they're the same. And we also know that our VMM and our SPF versions, we've already checked those and they're up to date. So you say, okay, that's not the version. So we go back to our event log. And so the next thing in our event log is this warning. REST client received unsuccessful response message. So you're thinking, REST, it can't talk to the API, something's going wrong there. So then what Mark was saying earlier is that every provider has a specific URL. So we want to go check our SPF URL. So we go back and we open up our SPF REST endpoint. And no matter how many times, or if you put in the right password, you won't be able to have access. Okay, so we aren't able to hit our SPF endpoint. So we need to go over to our SPF server and see what's going on. If we go over to our SPF server, we can open up the event logs there. And it's kind of confusing because you see the Microsoft Server SPF folder over here, and you look in the log and it doesn't really have anything, anything useful per se. So if we go into Microsoft and we go into the management OData, and we can open up the operational channel, we see our error. So this says that our user is not authorized to perform this, to hit this endpoint, okay? So you say, okay, well, we need to make sure he's a part of the 4 groups that every user should be a part of to hit all of the endpoints they need to hit to have a successful experience with their WAP deployment. So we go in and we go to check our user. If you double click on him and you see what he's a member of, we see that he's missing one of the 4 main groups. He should be part of a group called SPF_VMM. So, easy enough. We say, okay, if he's not a member of that, we just add him to it. We press OK. And so now we've given him this access to this group. All we do is we can run a quick IIS reset. and let that run. And then once it completes, we go back over to our admin server. We go back to our SPF endpoint, and we see that we successfully retrieved our information. So going back to our portal, then we should be able to do what we wanted to do in the first place. So if we refresh our portal, you notice we don't get that error. And then if we go to create a new VM role from our gallery, you see that all of the gallery items that we wanted in the first place are propagated because we had the right access. And now Bob's happy.
Thanks, Kylie. Within the VM clouds, there's another feature, which is great, but it's also tricky to configure, and that's remote console. Who has configured remote console in their environment? Who figured that was easy? I see no hands. That all has to do probably with the certificates and the way that the remote console session is actually set up. If we look at that, when I'm in the tenant side and I clicked on connect and select remote console, the following process will take place. The tenant side will talk to the API. We know where those log files are. It will talk to SPF. SPF will talk to VMM. And VMM is the one that has the certificate imported with a private key. That is the one that actually generates the RDP file and the hash. VMM will retrieve the information on which Hyper-V host is that VM running, and then inject that information into the RDP file as well. And SPF is actually the one based on URL rewrite that creates that RDP file and presents it to the user. So this is a file that will pop up, and the user can click it. When he clicks it, he connects to an RD gateway endpoint, which has the following event log that you can use if you hit issues. All the other ones you already know the event logs for. And that will then connect on port 2179 TCP to the Hyper-V host that was injected into the file. If we look at VM clouds, and the most common issues that I see there are related to permissions for the account that you use for registering it, and the account that is actually used for connecting throughout the environment. So it needs to have access to SQL, it needs to have access to VMM. The account for registering SPF, that's something that we usually do with a local account on the SPS server, as Kylie just demonstrated. Load balancers can be a pain. If you hit a load balancer issue, if you're not sure whether it's related to a load balancer issue, just bypass it. Create a local host file, enable a firewall rule which allows you to connect to an SPF server directly, shut down the other two machines, and just make it a single path. Make it easy for you to troubleshoot where the actual component is. Rule out all the components. This is the same with load balancers. Certificate, we just mentioned that. We saw certificate issues based with we saw that with identity. We saw that with the remote console. Certificates, very complicated if you don't set it up properly. And update rollups. Kylie just showed us that update rollups can have version mismatches. So if you're doing something with an update rollup, just make sure your environment is completely in sync, all the components are running the same update rollup, and verify it. You just saw it for VMM and SPF. It's easy to verify. Just go to Add Remove Programs, View Installed Programs, View Installed Updates. You can just see what update rollup was installed the latest. And for Windows Azure Pack, Control Alt A, that will give you the version number of Azure Pack as well. Websites, I thought I already asked that. A couple of people are using that. It's a big topic because websites uses like 6 components, which all require a dedicated machine. You can then add HA, which doubles that number. And if you add more workers, then it becomes even a huge environment. But it is a beautiful solution. I'll grab that together with Database as a Service because in essence, you can just use website alone, but if I want to deploy a WordPress site, that uses the MySQL database. Now, Windows Azure Pack does have a nice integration with that. Because there are so many different moving pieces, what I actually would like to do is look at 3 examples, and we'll demo all of those. We'll look at websites questions. There are a lot of installation and update issues related and compared to the other 2 RPs we just looked at. And what I actually want to do in the demo is these 5 things. And why 5? Because it will actually describe all the steps and touch all of the components within websites. It's a fairly simple demo, but it's a complex environment in the back and all the components that are hit, which actually makes it very interesting to look at. The first thing that I'll do is I'll create a WordPress site, which does the first 3 steps. It creates a database, MySQL database. It provisions a website, which is in essence just a parking page on a file server. And the last one is I publish content to that website and to that database, which is the WordPress content. And then I change it. And change it, I can do that complex with Visual Studio, Web Matrix, whatever, or I can just start and stop it. It is the same process. It will touch the same components. So I'm just going to start and stop it. And I'm actually going to connect to it. And connect is nothing else than hitting the URL and trying to open it. Now we'll look at creating the database. These 2, we already discussed those. It talks to a SQL API. That is a component that is part of the SQL or the Windows Azure Pack installer within the web API. So if you select that component, this is what installed. And you can test that endpoint by just opening an ODBC connection from the server that you're connecting from. Easy enough. Same goes for the SQL API. Now, please understand there's no ODBC connection for MySQL. But if you go to the MySQL site, you can download one, which you can add into ODBC connections. It just allows you to do an ODBC connection to MySQL as well. Provisioning a website, tenant side, API. You can test the endpoint, same as we did with the other 2. The most components within the website use the website's log, so we should at least be looking at that. There are a couple of exceptions, which we'll also discuss. The management server will connect to the runtime DB, will actually hold all the information for all the different websites and the web application files. It will then in its place communicate with the file server. Now this is also tricky because there's a local user account on the file server, which through group policy, for instance, could be reduced with the permissions it has. So a simple way to test if you have remote access, just do a net use with that particular user against that file server from the management server. Easy enough. Then actually publishing a website. So I've just created an empty website with that parking page, and I want to add content into it. That is retrieving information from the runtime DB again. Where is that website actually running? What file server is it using? Then it's the publisher server. And please remember this one because we're going to look at this in depth. And there are 2 event logs for the publishing server because it's using web deploy to actually deploy the packages towards the file server and the database of the website itself. In this case, the MySQL database. And then the file server, of course, to update the content of that file server too. You can just connect that with the command line for net use again. Chasing a website, same process. Connect to the runtime DB because the runtime DB knows where the website is actually living. It will then connect to the web worker, and the web worker is actually the server where your website is executed on. You can look at it with IIS. You're not going to see anything because it's using DWAS, and DWAS is like a special component which doesn't completely tie into IIS. So if you want to look at the websites and where they're located, just use the default management tools for that. And connecting to a website is nothing more than in the tenant portal, I'm clicking on the URL of the website. That will then redirect me to the front-end servers, which are also part of the cloud deployment of the websites. It has the same event log location. It will retrieve the information from the runtime DB. Where is that website located? on which web worker, and then through ARR will redirect me to that particular website running on that web worker. So we have a look at that demo again. Switch over. Close this one up. And we want to deploy a new website. Now I'm going to pick one from the gallery. Zoom out again. And I'm going to do the easy one that everybody knows is a WordPress site. So go to blogs, select WordPress, give it a name, Ignite. And I say I want to create a new SQL database too. So it's a single wizard, which actually does 3 different things. But it's user-friendly in that case. I'll give the database a name, Ignite DB. And I also need to specify a name. So call that Ignite password for accessing that database. And that's it. So zoom in again. So it's now, first of all, creating the database. The second thing that it's doing is creating a parking page. So it's creating that website. And the third thing it's doing is publishing content through the publisher server against the database of the website to update it with that WordPress content. Let's see if it's actually going properly. I have rehearsed it, so it should fail. Yes, it does. And if we look at the details, it says provisioning failed. The database could not be created. Now, I just explained that the first thing that I'll do is create a database. And that took fairly long. So I'm still Bob. He sees that error and he says, well, why is the database not created? So he clicks the MySQL database tab. And he sees that the database is created, which is confusing for him because he just got the error that the database wasn't created. So what he can do is create a new database again just to check if it's actually working. So instead of going through the wizard which does those 3 things, I'm only going to do that one step is create a database. So call that Ignite test. The username also the same. Ignite test. Complex password. So complex that it's not the same. That's better. And it actually creates a database. Now that is strange because I just got the error that it wasn't installed properly. So we're going to do the same thing again. I'm just going to go to the admin or the tenant side event log and have a look there. So refresh this one. And it will actually give me a couple of errors, and we can drill into them, which will say that the database could not be created. So I'm seeing the same logs here, which isn't making much sense to me. So the next step would be to test the endpoint. Well, I could create the database, so I should be able to communicate with the endpoint. I can test it if we want to, but it doesn't really make sense. So I could just hit the endpoint. So where is it? Websites endpoint. So I'm just going through the same process. Within the deployment of websites, you actually have to configure this account. I'm able to access the endpoint. So the problem isn't really there. So the next step would be one level down in the endpoint itself with its management server, looking at the event log there. So I'm opening up the management server, open up event viewer, and going to the server itself, applications and services, Microsoft, and we just said websites. So I'm looking at websites. Here it is. Well, not really an error. And these are like a couple of minutes old. This is already a couple of hours old, so no issue here. So the next step is the publisher. Well, I'm just going through the path we just discussed. So I'm looking at the publisher. Close this one out, select the publisher. Applications and services, Microsoft, Windows, and go to websites. Well, there is an error there, but it's very old. So this isn't the case either. Maybe then web deploy, because we just saw that the publisher also uses the web deploy event log. So look at that one, errors. And these are actually an error which could relate to the time that we'll be looking at. And if we drill down into that one, it says the database Ignite could not be created, which is kind of strange because the command is coming from the management endpoint, not the publisher. So why is the publisher giving me this error? And if we drill down a bit more, it actually says unable to connect to any of the MySQL hosts. Call to get host entry while querying for mysql.ignite.com. So my simple assumption would be, let's go to that publisher server then. Let's do a lookup and see if I can query on mysql.ignite.com. It doesn't give me any IP address, which makes sense because the publisher server was trying to push the content out to the database. And it doesn't know what the database actually is. So I'm going back to the domain controller. Let's have a look at the DNS there. I did create a forward lookup zone, didn't I? Yeah, there it is. But it doesn't contain any record. So I'm not able to look up, and I know the IP by heart because I've done it a zillion times. So this is 102.81. That one, go back to the publisher, rerun that again, and that's actually giving me an IP address back now. So exit this one. Flush the DNS just to make sure. Go back to the tenant side, close this one out, and actually create a new website through the same process. Select the WordPress site. I'll give it a different name, web. Create a new database. WebDB, username, password, and it still fails. Great. Now this is an error that I didn't hit yet, but it's due to the quota. I'm not able to create any websites anymore. But what should be interesting, though, is that I would be able to, for instance, connect to an existing website. Which is actually a WordPress site. Now, what I just did was all the process we stepped through, beside stopping and starting it. So I could just go to that particular website, or even restart it for that matter. And with the small demo, we now touched all of the website's components, so all 6. And we just did the same thing as we saw within the slides. Does that make any sense? Great. Back to the deck then. There are a lot of websites learnings. And the first thing is, if I want to create a custom domain, so my own domain name for a website, what IP address should I use? Use the IP address of the load balancer of the front-end service. So that's one. If you're installing it, and you're reinstalling it and reinstalling it against the same service, the first reinstall will fail, and that has to do because there's a registry key will actually set it to a certain cloud ID. You can clear this with this. Uninstall the component, clear the registry key, and you can use that same server again. Don't use IaaS admin on the admin servers or on the web workers, because you're going to see nothing. IaaS is not tied into DWAS. So DWAS is a bootstrapper. It uses the normal processes that you would for IaaS. It is in essence a piece of IaaS, but not totally the same. And on the controller server, if you want to see information about your environment for websites specifically, on the controller server there's a PowerShell module which is installed automatically, which is called websites. And you can just retrieve all the commandlets there and have a look at that environment. Now the tenant is not looking too happy though. This is something that I don't see very regularly. And I'm very curious to figure out if you are running Service Bus in your environment. Who does? One hand. I would like to talk to you afterwards. I don't see a lot of questions on Service Bus either. It is a very interesting solution, which I believe will in the future we'll hear more about. I'm not going to demo that because of the lack of interest at this time. But if we look at troubleshooting an issue, the process is the same again. The app inside registers to an API, which is the Service Bus API. The Service Bus API has its own event log. If we go testing that endpoint, that is possible directly through a URL on a custom port, which is 9359. You can retrieve that information by going to the Service Bus server and running that PowerShell command get sbfarm. That will actually show that URL and actually also the port number. Same goes for the tenant side. It will actually go to the same stream. Now this one, usage, if we see hands there, who has configured usage? 2 hands, 3 hands. There are a lot of questions related to usage because there are a lot of components that are involved with usage, specifically for VM clouds. You can see that most of the questions are related to configuration. We'll look at the usage path. Now this is a bit different, and that has to do because I usually don't want to open up SQL tables, but there's no other way in this case. You need to look at SQL tables. And if we look at the way that the path will go is actually the usage API, Windows Azure Pack, which has its own database. And within that database, there's a table called usage records. That usage API will communicate with all the RPs we just saw automatically, but not SPF. That's something that you'll need to define and configure yourself. So that makes it more complex. You can just test the endpoint again. That is the same. And we already saw for SPF where you can find the logs there. The SPF database holds the current set for the metrics. So there's a table there that's interesting to look at too. Then SPF communicates with SCOM. SCOM will retrieve the information from VMM, and they all have their own databases. There is a report on the SCOM server which you can execute to look if actual information is retrieved. VMM has a SCOM connector. These are all steps that are documented fine. The intention of this slide is to give you an idea, okay, let's say it doesn't work anymore. I've set it up, it did work, and it doesn't work anymore. What should I do? What component should I be looking at? And VMM actually talks to Hyper-V, and there's an operation manager event log. That's interesting there. Now, instead of going from top to bottom, I'm going the other way. Because if I'm going from top to bottom, and somewhere in the bottom my information isn't coming up, then I have a long way down, because there's a lot of information to look at. So start troubleshooting this from the bottom. So we'll start with VMM, actually. Let's go back. There are a couple of things to look at. When we have the connector set up, so I'm assuming in this environment you already have this configured. It's just not working. The first thing that you might do best is go to Operation Manager. Within the Operation Manager, if you configure reporting, that is an additional configuration that you'll need to do. There is a report when you have set up the connection with VMM that allows you to view the virtual machine utilization. So if we open that up and add an object, you can just search, we'll pop up the VMs that we have running, add one, doesn't really matter which one, and say run. Now this will take a couple of seconds, so in the meanwhile, while this is running, these are the things that you should be looking at if this information is empty. First of all, go to VMM. In VMM, go to Settings, and within Settings to System Center Settings, and there is your Operation Manager server. When we double-click that, the details which should give you a connection status which is OK. That's more than enough. Then you have configured it and this properly. The second thing that we should be looking at is the permissions of the admin account of SCOM and the admin account of VMM. They should have permissions vice versa, meaning that on the VMM server, in the administrators group, we should find the administrator account for SCOM. So if we open it up, I see that the SCOM access account is actually there. If we look on the SCOM server, administrator's account, I should have the SPS account there. That's true also. So that's fine. So close these two out. We see that it actually retrieves information. So the communication between VMM and Operation Manager, that is working properly. The next step to follow is the communication going from Operation Manager to SPF. Now we look at SPF. There are a couple of things to look at, and we should be looking at SQL first, because SQL needs permissions on the account that's running the application pool of SPF usage. So if we look at SPF, close everything down, and we go to IIS, there are a couple of application pools. Now this application pool usage, and actually all the application pools, should be running on a domain account. And that domain account needs a couple of permissions. The first permission that it'll need is we go back to SQL, look into security, logins. We should find that same account there. We open it up. We go to user mappings. There's actually the Operation Manager data warehouse there. And there's one additional set of permission that account does require, and that is the Operation Manager reader. So you should verify that information is there. Then what you should also verify, we go back to SPF. There's actually a commandlet that you need to execute to set this up, which will configure which server is running the Operation Manager data warehouse and what server is your root management server. So we can just verify that information by importing the module and then executing the get SC SPF setting. And there's some information in there. The first one is the name. Now the name should be pointing at the SQL server that's actually running the Operation Manager data warehouse. Then the setting string and the value, those should be the same, and they should be pointing to the same thing. So the SQL server that's running the Operation Manager data warehouse, and it should also reference the data warehouse itself. And the last one is the server name. That one should reference the root management server. These are all things that you can just verify within your environment if you have an issue. Now the next step up is Windows Azure Pack. And Windows Azure Pack also has an API. So we open up IIS there. We go to Sites. And we go to Usage. There's a URL for usage for testing at endpoint. Now I have that in my shortcuts. And it requires me to enter credentials. Now if you set up this for the first time, there is a default set of credentials what you're unable to retrieve. So you could run a PowerShell script, and that's something that you should do when you're actually connecting a billing adapter, because you need to have those credentials. And that is just by having not the correct one, this one. By running these two commands, and you even have the password now, and that will actually set this user account with this password for the usage API. So if I go back and then execute that URL again, or is it the web users endpoint usage SVC, and that would open up a JSON file. There we go. Retrieving the last entry. Let's close this all out together. Containing the last entry of the table that's actually in SQL. So we'll go to the usage endpoint, continue, usage SVC, and there we have that last entry. So all the APIs have an endpoint that you can use to validate if the information is flowing through the environment. Now you can also open up all those SQL tables that are mentioned in the slide that will help you get some more insight of the matches between those different tables and the identifiers between those. But this is in essence the flow throughout the system, so start from the bottom and work your way up. And the most important thing that I'd like to say for usage is verify your settings. Verify, verify, verify. Because I've seen so many environments where usage wasn't working or inconsistent or whatever, and we just went through each step that I just went through, and somehow always something is configured incorrectly. So just verify that everything is set up correctly. There's enough documentation out there to give you the proper steps. Usually they're related to permissions. This is the one case that you can use SQL databases to at least look at the information. Please don't change it in the tables. We've seen issues with time zone related. I just explained that my Windows Azure Pack environment was running in Azure and my resource providers were running on-prem. If I would have different time zone for those, the information will be inconsistent because the time zone is recorded for the metric that is flowing through the system. So make sure that the time zones are in order. While the tenant is already, so Bob, he just recuperated a bit. He's not drunk anymore. He's feeling okay. He's cycling in the park. But we, Superman, cloud admins, we're still stuck here because we need to look at SMA. That's the last thing we need to look at. Now, SMA is getting more and more traction and also more questions, as you can see. Most of them related to configuration. If we look at SMA, and the path that's actually going through, you don't see any tenant side here because there is no direct tenant interaction with SMA. It is configured within the admin portal alone. There are triggers that you can set for a tenant to, I wouldn't say interact, but if it deploys a virtual machine, for instance, that can trigger a runbook, but it's still not something that he can do manually. It's something that the admin must configure. We saw that path before. The web service for SMA also has an endpoint that you can use. The URL is referenced here. I haven't counted the zeros. I'm not sure who figured that out, that it would be a good idea to have such a number of zeros, but just copy it over is probably the easiest one. There is one exception, which is actually SPF, because when I set a trigger, SPF is the one that is executing that runbook, not the admin API, which has its own endpoint, as we already saw before. The web service will talk to the runbook worker. All the PowerShell commandlets that you're executing should be installed on the runbook worker. That is the point where the actual PowerShell command is executed from. An easy way to test that is just do a PowerShell remoting from the runbook worker directly against the object that you're executing your PowerShell script against. There are a couple of things related to SMA. When you install the web service, you could already prepare the certificate that you want to use for that. Don't use it during installation because the installation will fail. Just use the self-signed certificate for the installation and change the binding of the certificate afterwards. Like I mentioned, the triggers. Triggers are very great, but it requires you to have SMA and SPF in the same domain because you need to add the SPF account to a local group on the SMA servers. So please consider that while you're designing your environment, SPF and SMA in the same domain if you want to have those triggers set on VM roles. I think when we're looking at all those different RPs, and there's a lot of ground to cover, it just comes down to this bare essence. Just try to repro the issue if you have an issue. Follow the blood flowing through your vein to that body part that has an issue. Rule out components, so firewalls, certificates, DNS, GPOs, whatever. Rule out the dependencies that it's relying on, so that the DNS issue, for instance, we saw, and verify your settings. There's a lot of documentation out there which describes how to install it properly. Just verify if you actually did it, or is there a GPO overruling a setting that you've done. And at the end of the day, we, the cloud admins, we fly home, and the environment's sweet, up and running again. Thank you guys for your time. Oh, and please evaluate the session. That will really help us. Thanks a lot.